Hello, everyone. I am Ben Pick, and thank you for joining me in Running to Write, where I give questionable writing advice through running metaphors. Try to keep things positive here, but I had a recent conversation with someone who suggested that my thoughts on some recent shows would make a great topic to discuss here. The problem is that for a lot of those shows, my opinions are almost entirely negative. So here we go for my rant on quality control and my tips on how we can avoid sinking into the same pitfalls that, if you can't tell by my thumbnail, this episode's thumbnail, well, there are some shows that I was just thoroughly disappointed in. But before we do that, let's check out how the chat's going. So, Richard, thank you for joining in. Adrienne, thank you for being here. And happy Monday. Yes, second dinner is even more tantalizing. Yep. Yeah, I stopped doing the countdown, so I guess I should probably do that because it gives me a chance to collect my thoughts and know exactly when I'm coming in. Let me fix that a little bit. There we go. But I don't know. Somebody complained, so I'm just trying to experiment with not doing those. And yes, Richard, you are in fact responsible for everything that's about to happen in this episode. I can only blame you. Oh, thank you. I don't know. It's hit or miss. People. So I have like a widow's peak. So people are very bad about cutting it so that it looks good. But hey, a week from now, my hair should be better. And yes, I'm not angry. I'm disappointed. It's also I'm disappointed in the time I spent watching the show. There are definitely certain series and certain. Well, my next point is tonight's episode topic. So let's actually try and stay on topic somewhat. But yeah. Can't remember if I said this or not. So here we go for my rant on quality control and my tips on how we can avoid sinking in the same pitfalls. I think I already said that. But tonight's episode topic, what does it take to destroy a legacy? Maybe I'm being a bit too harsh here, but there has been an observable and measurable decline in some of my favorite series when it comes to basics like plot and character development or character motivations as well. These shows and books are doing nothing short of ruining a legacy. This is why I'm hesitant to invoke the pillars of certain stories when trying to sell a new show, which I've heard is means of advertising the current ones. The overwhelming praise for Dune Part 2 feels unearned, or at best, overcompensating. Now, I haven't actually seen Dune 2. That's one of my goals for this week. But put another way, when I find a water station 10 miles into a Scorch River run, I don't question the quality of the water. And much like, even though I haven't watched Dune 2 yet, well, the hype surrounding it, it's only going to serve to leave me disappointed. There's no way that this is a ground-shattering movie. It's just that the alternatives have been so bottom drudgingly terrible that anything mediocre gets raised to astronomical levels by comparison. And I feel like I've been stuck in a drought with the movies coming out. So I run by a movie theater on my runs, the long ones, and I see the posters for upcoming attractions. And yeah, they look terrible. Like every single movie for the past couple of years has looked just abysmal. And it's so bad that they're actually re-releasing the 25th anniversary movies in an attempt to bring people into theaters. And for what's worth, the Brandon Fraser Mummy is easily better than every movie that I've seen in theaters over the past 10 years. Now, the exceptions obviously when I go to like Alamo Drafthouse and I'm watching again an older movie that they just happen to be showing there. So recent movies bad, older movies significantly better in terms of quality. And that's, I mean, I would say measurable. Like you can measure how you can track a character's plot and growth from the start of the movie to the end and see how much they have changed. Whereas in a lot of movies here, they're basically the same. And there's nothing wrong with characters who stay the same. Like you got your gunslingers, you got your Clint Eastwoods, etc., who are meant to be stagnant, but they change the world around them, oftentimes for the better. Whereas a lot of times in the modern stories, if you think about what's actually happening, the characters are worse off, the world is worse off, and the world though the characters might set off for saving the world, they usually just end up destroying it. And so, yeah, going back on topic, both Doctor Who and Star Wars are well on their way to foregoing things like measurable good storytelling. As I just described, you can kind of measure plot arcs and tension and a whole bunch of details like that in favor of, I honestly don't know. Aside from a steady injection of content to our streaming platforms and cheap attempts at money grabs, if not a blatant example of money laundering in the case of New Lord of the Rings, I don't know what a lot of these shows are getting out of it. And what I do mean by money laundering is, like, if you look at the quality of the armor that was made for the Lord of the Rings movies, whereas you have just the printed on shirts that look like armor from a distance for New Lord of the Rings, there has, considering that the new Lord of the Rings TV show costs 10 times as much to make as the movies, and the effort put into those shows is a fraction, a tenth of whatever. Like, there has to be money. My assumption is there has to be money laundering along the way, or just people who are, or they've assembled people who are really bad at their jobs, and that's who kind of congregated into the making of Lord of the Rings. I shouldn't even say Lord of the Rings because that's invoking a greater story. I guess the Fall of Numenor is probably the best way of putting it. And that's one of my great fears about my Into the Void series. The feedback I received is that my third book is by far the best written, and I only want to improve with each novel. That's not to say that the first and second weren't bad. It's just that the way I tell a story, the characters involved, and the arcs they go on, again, measurable storytelling, even though it's very subjective in terms of whether or not the story is good, you can still measure how well a story is told objectively. So whether that's in the tension or in a character arc, etc. And measurably, I've gotten better with each book I've written, which makes sense. I've gotten more experience. I've gotten better as an author. I've know what to look for. At some point, that's no longer possible. You can't continually keep advancing, but that does mean in the here and now that I am writing my fourth novel at a crawling pace. At each step, I check my plot, my characters, my ideas, and evaluate them individually and together. I do not want to end up like my fallen heroes. So these are the 5 lessons I've learned to not include in my story based on the worst examples of modern storytelling. Oh, okay. So Adrian disagrees with me, thinks that, yeah, sure. First of all, I did not say acting was the problem. So Adrian's talking about the Doctor Who actor who portrays the Doctor. And I didn't say actor, I said character arcs. And to be fair, I do think that overall I did enjoy the Doctor Who series. I will say I got a very specific example for just a terrible episode, from the idea formulation to its impact, which, spoiler alert, there is none, to how it was going through. And there were a lot of individual issues throughout the season where I thought there was an episode all about space babies, where there were just these babies. There were these babies who were in control of a space station, and it was some sciencey reason why they didn't advance, even though they were 6 years old. They never advanced out of babyhood, and yet, despite being 6 years old, they were. It's a whole very complicated thing, but that episode was, decent enough. It felt like basic Doctor Who for me, except it was really annoying that every time they referred to the babies, they would say, hey, these babies are doing something, and then they would go back and be like, I mean space babies. So every time they said the word babies, they had to go back and change and correct themselves to say space babies. No, actually, I thought the musical episode was pretty good. I liked it. I liked the villain that was portrayed. It was interesting. It was a bit corny that they had the Beatles and then the Beatles were never actually used to resolve the issue. I think that was kind of a wasted potential, but I liked what they did for the episode and what that essentially that character is a lost god, the villain is, and I thought that was really interesting. So yeah. um Sorry, I'm doubling back to Oh, so yeah, Twisters apparently is pretty good. So, that's the thing. Anyways, let me get on to my what I want to say. So, first of all things should matter within the story. As I mentioned in Doctor Who, there was an episode which was utter nonsense. Essentially, it was a time loop in which nothing happens and nothing changes. Because the events were overwritten, none of the events of the episode took place. Not that big of a deal. That's a common trope in Doctor Who. Except when the trope occurs and the present timeline that we watch through the duration of the episode gets rewound and something new happens to undo all the 40 minutes that we watched, the characters at least have changed. Because otherwise, the 40 minutes that we watched would be an utter waste of time. And because in this specific episode, the episode's events no longer took place, the disaster which the characters prevented will not happen because the main character wasn't there to stop it. So the characters don't remember this alternate timeline, so they have no chance to grow based on what they experienced. Side note, despite one of the characters living her full life, we don't see her learn anything. She is hunting a mystery for 80 years and never learns why, which means that we don't actually learn why, which means that it's up to the Reddit community to sort of piece together mystery and create our own headcanon, which is really dumb because that's not, like, that defeats the whole purpose of the episode. And the character was also mentally stuck as a 20-year-old because we never see her act like an adult. Even when she's in her 40s or whatever, moving on, she still kind of whines like she would as the 20-year-old character that we've grown to know throughout the season. She only moves from day to day in a vignette until she sees her purpose in stopping a dictator and monster of a man from taking office in a very heavy-handed episode. Again, I have no problem with the heavy-handed. Well, in theory, I don't have a problem with Doctor Who being that heavy-handed when it is every episode is like, hey, we're going to just smack you in the face with social commentary. It gets a little bit rough. And I do have a point about that later, so I'll hurry up and get to it. But in other words, because the characters don't remember anything, because the events no longer happened since they went back in time and undid them, there was no reason to watch this episode. There was no change, there was no growth, or any follow-up actions as a response to the events. And the details and rules of 73 yards were utter nonsense that felt like somebody threw spaghetti at a wall with plot points tied to the end of it and just sort of wrote an episode based on what stuck. Although the world was saved in the timeline, that future gets undone because of, to invoke better Doctor Who phrases, timey-wiminess. In other words, if the details of the episode didn't happen, which they canonically no longer do, then there was no reason to watch the episode. Period. Which means that I wasted, I mean, yes, in theory, all time spent watching TV is wasted. But in actuality, in the canon of the show, in terms of just pure entertainment points, if you are a fan of Doctor Who, just skip 73 yards. It's a meaningless episode. There was a throwaway line during the series climax, which vaguely referenced the episode, but again, and it did explain the purpose of the 73 yards. It's really dumb. And since the events of the episode no longer happened, that was entirely for the audience, not for the story being told. For writing, every scene in our stories needs to happen for a reason. There will be some intellectual moments in my story where the events may not actually be happening. Even so, those are the defining moments of the characters and the story. Again, slight spoilers for my story. There are, within my book 4 story conclusion, I'm planning to write some illusion scenes which only take place in the character's head. It still is a work in progress. It still is in theory. I'm a long way away from there, but I'm planning to do it, except that the characters will change because of the events that happen. So even though what happens in their head doesn't exactly happen in reality, they are changed because of the events. And because, like I mentioned, it's in the climax, well, those events matter. The way I write, events in the previous novel may seem superfluous, or especially in book 1, but they all build up to something meaningful. There were a lot of complaints I got with my first book was that it took a while for the action to really start, but I laid the foundation for every single major event within book one. And certain minor details in book one become major problems in books 2 and 3. To give a real quick recap of the first 3 novels in my series, the characters make a specific mistake in book one, which leads to the plot of book 3. Now, the only reason why they can't jump right to what they want to do, the goals they want to accomplish in book 3, is because of the challenges they face in book 2, which sprung up from the lesser mistakes they made in book 1. Now, I make a tiny plot detail and characters matter. That is my goal within my stories. So even though one of the complaints with my first book was that it's a bit slow to start because it's sort of the goings on in the characters' lives, there is still meaning behind it. No, I'm not doing any singing episodes. And yes, my wife agrees that episode 73 yards was dumb, and we were just critiquing it the entire time. And that's where a lot of this episode came from, because we were like, this doesn't make sense. And if they do this, if they're acting this way, then they should be doing it this way, but they aren't doing it this way. So this is just dumb. And yeah, it was, oh boy. Yeah, I've actually decided to include a comment about The Boys. So yes, The Boys is heavy-handed, but Doctor Who is just so egregiously worse. Every single episode had some kind of heavy-handed thing going on in there. And at least with The Boys, I can sort of see how the dominoes fall within the series. Now, number 2, no cameos. As much as I like Jack Black, his appearance along with Lizzo, Bill Barr, and a whole bunch of others were nothing short of abominations for the Star Wars universe. They detracted from the story being told by breaking the fourth wall, because Star Wars is not Deadpool. And honestly, even in Deadpool, it gets a little bit overdone. Same thing with Harley Quinn, where when you break the fourth wall enough, plot stop mattering. It's like Captain Phasma in the Star Wars movies. There may have been a plan to do something meaningful with that character, but instead the blood-sucking marketers wildly overpromised her importance. They used an actress from an Emmy award-winning show, Game of Thrones, to bolster interest in Star Wars for scenes and a character who was ultimately irrelevant. This is looking at my first point from a different angle. Taken to its extremes, there were real-life politicians in the not-so-recent Star Wars episode. I know Star Wars is inherently political, and that's perfectly fine. They had the first, I want to say, I'm fairly confident it was the first interracial on-screen kiss, and it's not even close to the subtle metaphors for the various alien species the crews have come across. There was like one planet where each person was like split in two, so they would be black on one side and white on the other, or white on one side and black on one side, white on the other, or black on one side and white on the other. Either way, they were reverses of each other, and it was very good allegory. It was a well thought out episode, but even with that defining characteristic, I still would say that they weren't hitting us over the head with the allegory. However, by showing a real politician on Star Trek, it's similar to the show taking a political stance and endorsing someone beyond the screens. First of all, this dates the episode, removing any timeless nature to it. And second of all, I would be absolutely pissed if either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump or any political candidate appeared in any show that I liked. I know there was Biden showing up in Parks and Recreation. I mean, I was never really a big Parks and Rec fan to begin with, so I don't really have a say in that. And sure, Leslie Knope, the main character, was, idolized, whatever. I don't have the experience to talk about that. I can just say when situations like that occur in the shows that I know very well. But most of my TV watching is to escape reality. which means that breaking that fourth wall is, in my opinion, largely inexcusable. What does this look like in our writing? Well, be careful when adding real moments to our stories like celebrities and events. My book takes place in a nebulous Maryland suburb, and my characters are mostly high schoolers. I could throw in a scene where they go to HF Festival, which is a local DC festival that was around in like the mid 2000s, but that would immediately date my novels because HF Festival, despite how much they try to bring it back, has functionally died. Even though it keeps coming back every decade or so. I think there's one that's been trying to come out this year, or maybe it did already happen. I don't know. It's nothing compared to the glory days when they would fill up a literal stadium with the late 90s and early 2000 hits. Including that my novel and naming any musical artist would take away from the fantasy and science fiction stories that I would tell, unless I'm doing a period piece and I want my novel to take place explicitly in, say, 2003. Now, that being said, I could easily make up a festival and various singers so long as they were plot relevant. Or to go back to Star Trek, it's like I don't know, it was either the first or second one with Chris Pine in it, where they're like, oh, we found this classical rock music thing that we should play here. And then all of a sudden, they're trying to make a joke about how, oh, this is some ancient piece of music that we found. And so we as the audience are thinking like, oh, 1700, he found something with Beethoven. And then, of course, Sabotage by the Beastie Boys starts playing. It was dumb. I rolled my eyes. I don't enjoy new Star Trek. It tries to be Star Wars, but Star Trek is supposed to be something different, and that is neither here. That is not a topic for tonight's conversation. But yeah, I don't enjoy new Star Trek. Mainly because new Star Trek is just reboots of previous Star Trek. Yeah. We don't need to go off on that tangent. Number 3, unearned power creep. In Ahsoka, one of the characters spent years training in the Force. Another has a sudden ability to wield the Force, which he never demonstrated before. So Ahsoka is a live-action sequel series to what was Rebels. And in it, you have this kid as Ezra Bridger, who trained with a Jedi. Then you also have this sharpshooter who was a Mandalorian, and yet she never demonstrated any special abilities with the Force throughout Rebels. So Rebels was, I don't know, 3-4 seasons. That could have been fine if she spent the years between Rebels and Ahsoka studying the Force and preparing. Except we're shown and told that she has a negligible amount of the Force and that she basically skipped all of her studying. She can't move a coffee cup within Ahsoka and doesn't train for the few days that Ahsoka takes place. Sure, she fights with a lightsaber, but anybody can pick it up and wheel it around. And she's shown to be weak when using it every single time. She's a gunslinger. She's a blaster. She's a pilot. She's a lot of things, but she's not a Jedi. And then during the climax of the series, that character who has never demonstrated substantial magical power in the Force is able to hurl her friend a good 20 feet using the Force. When unearned power creep happens in good stories, it comes at a cost. Maybe the character is born with magic inside them, which corrupts them when they pull too much, or they have a creature inside them where they're constantly struggling to maintain control of their body. So for most of the Naruto series, a demon fox is living inside of the main character and it's trying to literally take over his body. Whenever Naruto draws from that power, he is opening himself up to the corruption of that other force. So sure, there is plenty of power creep, and he is able to excel far beyond what he should be able to, at least initially, and then he starts spending, years devoted to studying. But that's power creep because he's borrowing the power, and frankly, there are multiple points where he loses control of himself. He gives into the anger, and the demon fox comes out and starts attacking friend and foe alike. In fact, there's one major incident where he thinks he severely harmed a lot of the people in his hometown, and he becomes devastated because of it. So if there is unearned power, it needs to come at a cost. Even if the power is earned through training, it still should have a risk versus reward decision. Basically, don't pull a Star Wars where the plot happened. Number 4, brilliance diminished. I'm not done with Star Wars. So in the good Star Wars, let me see if I can do this. Nope. Well, I have the book somewhere over here, but there's this wonderful Thrawn trilogy from the 90s written by Timothy Zahn, which I frequently go back to in describing how amazing Star Wars can be. But there was a brilliant villain in there whose defining characteristic was his military strategy. He accounts for every possibility in his enemies because he understands them. He puts himself in their mindset and then imagines what they would do and then comes up with an infinite number of plans to counteract that. When he was defeated in the no longer canon EU extended universe, it was through a combined series of small mistakes and the galactic secret that he could never have predicted, namely that Leia was Vader's daughter. That last point is something no military leader could have guessed. The EU devoted a wonderful amount of care into raising this villain up as a genius and then destroyed him in a believable manner. Again, it wasn't one single flaw. It was a series of oversights, I would say. And things that, again, no military leader could reasonably predict. New Star Wars didn't take that approach. This same character, Thrawn, he did nothing impressive. He was a villain in Rebels. He was a villain in Ahsoka. In fact, Ahsoka's entire purpose is to, spoiler alert, bring him back into the universe. So Rebels ended with space whales that brought him to a different universe, and he couldn't come back. That was a sacrifice that the main character made. Now Ahsoka is all about the villains trying to bring him back, and then the heroes go along with it because that way they can try and bring back their hero, which is really stupid. But again, plot had to happen for a reason. So anyways, New Thrawn's plans were littered with easily escapable scenarios as bad as Dr. Evil. And as my wife mentioned, we are going through The Boys right now. Well, there is a character who is the most brilliant person on the planet. That's her superpower. Except the way the story seems to be going, again, I'm 4 episodes in, but the way the series seems to be going makes her out to be Ozymandias from the better, what was that series? Drawing a blank from it, but the one that was making fun of the DC universe with Dr. Manhattan. Anyways, in that show, Ozymandias knew Dr. Manhattan for decades, and he knew exactly how to tear him apart. In The Boys, you have a person who's basically Watchmen. Thank you. It's called The Watchmen. I appreciate that. Sweetie, you're awesome. So anyways, you have the brilliant character in The Boys who's only just brilliant. She doesn't have years of experience working with the people she's basically trying to take down from the inside, which makes the storytelling that much worse. Because again, I don't care how brilliant you are, you can never predict how people will react. Sure, there are some educated guesses you can make, like certain characters being willing to hook up with others, but the critical failings that cause a lot of the issues, they would have been impossible to predict. So I'm not all the way through the episode. I can't pass full-on judgment, but the way The Boys seems to be going is leading us towards a storyline which I don't think is earned. Now, originally, I wasn't planning to do a number 5. I don't like complaining about series that I used to like. So I was going to only do 4 tips to avoid the exponential decline of quality in my favorite series. At least that's what I wanted to say. However, since drafting the script, I came across another long-running series, which I love, that has since become a shell of its former self as it insults its viewership with disastrous storytelling. So, number 5, don't tell us one thing and show us something else. Now, oh, hey, Eloise, Felicia, thank you for joining us. You are just in time. Yeah, I will say that. But I will, not Kathleen Kennedy, but I will give episode 9 some credit. So I actually watched why it sucks so badly, and it makes sense. I will go into it at the end of this. The Akashite. Wow. Yeah. I honestly don't know. So I need to watch. I thought Doom 1 was okay. Um, Dune 2 I haven't actually seen yet, so I will need to check it out. And let's see, we're talking about the prequels. Yeah, the prequels are bad, the sequels are bad. Honestly, the remakes of the originals, I love seeing the special editions in theaters, but they are objectively bad now that I go back and watch them. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. But Richard, time to talk about Doctor Who again. And outright stating that we are going up against, or that the characters are going up against the most deadly foe they've ever faced, or this is the most brilliant strategist they've ever faced against. Okay, telling us that is really, really dumb. It's bad storytelling, it's bad character development to tell us that. But as a shorthand, it's not the worst egregious offense that we can do. No, the worst thing we can do, or the worst thing a storyteller can do, is to have that basic strategist make basic errors, or have their plan be easily thwarted, or they want to kill the hero, they have the means to do it, they have everything going their way, but they just don't. Then what we're told, that they're this brilliant strategist who has a goal, who wants the hero is eliminated, but they just don't do it. That conflicts with what we're told. So when there's, despite being told that somebody's a strategist, despite being told that this is the most deadly foe we've ever faced, if the solution is gone in 5 minutes, if they undo death spraying across all time because the anti-death is life, there's just some really dumb things that are going on. Yeah, likewise, when a season ends with a villain looking at the camera and stating, well, this hero gets her happy ending, but the main hero is about to suffer. Again, that's terrible storytelling. That's not a good cliffhanger for a season when a villain looks at the camera and says, hey, they did pretty good this time. And sure, somebody's getting a nice little reward. She earned it. But that hero, the main hero, the doctor, he's going to suffer. So stay tuned. That's just dumb. There's no excuse for something that bad to happen. And Doctor Who this season, there were multiple times where I yelled at the TV because the characters looked at the camera and pulled a, I'm going to be crude here, Jay and Silent Bob, where, the entire movie where they break the fourth wall and just say the quiet part out loud. Like, that is just egregious when it comes to Doctor Who or Star Wars or so many things. Sure, they get away with it in Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back because, again, it's a Kevin Smith movie where, you kind of know what you're getting when you're going into it, unless you watch Tusk, which is, just terrible. But I am going way off topic. Building off of this, don't build up a mystery that never delivers. So going back to Star Wars, I'll combine Ahsoka and Bad Batch here, as I didn't really enjoy watching either show. Bad Batch started off great and then got worse the more it went on. And in Bad Batch, there was a project code name called Necromancer, which drove the plot of the multiple seasons of the series were driven by that simple codename Necromancer. It wasn't a throwaway detail like the experimental cloning research facility taking place on a planet readers would know from the extended universe. That's a nice nod, but irrelevant to the story. I like that. It was a fun Easter egg, even if it does invoke a better story. Again, the Timothy Zahn universe. My problem is that the driving force of Bad Batch was surrounding this project codenamed Necromancer, which is never explained. I mean, ultimately, if you read between the lines, when you call something Project Necromancer, you know what you're getting. But this is the explanation for somehow Palpatine returned. And it wouldn't have taken much to connect the dots. We could have had a throwaway line about, I don't know. So we could have had a throwaway line about creating a clone army of Jedi where someone ominously adds in, beneath their breath, or grant a Sith Lord immortality. Sure, That would have been, not the best way of handling it, but it would have been better than not handling it at all. Instead, we're left with a plot relevant series long mystery that went nowhere, thus making the overall journey we took throughout Bad Batch feel less. This felt like the red wedding moment between my wife and I, where I knew that Project Necromancer could be a subtle justification to retcon the abysmal movie, episode 9, except the show never delivered on that payoff. So, yeah, that's really all that that comment deserves. But at the end of Bad Batch, my wife was convinced that we missed an episode because we never learned what Project Necromancer does or how it connects to the greater Star Wars universe, among several other significant plot holes. Yeah, we learned Project Necromancer was looking for Force-sensitive clones to replicate, but it never explained why. And that led to the conversation between me and my wife about Project Necromancer, which, again, she obviously knew what Project Necromancer was about because of the name Project Necromancer. But when I explained how it would be used in Bad Batch or the greater Star Wars universe, and how it was probably the reason that Palpatine returns, although that's not actually canon, and that's just in the Reddit community for theories about Bad Batch, because, again, the community surrounding the show has to fill in the gaps that were missing from the plot itself. Well, to quote my wife, that's really dumb. When I write, I do include mysteries or plot points which carry across books. Those build up over time. However, they are at best tangentially related to the plot. For example, in my first novel, a side character goes missing, but the main plot is still happening. So there's a promise to searching for them later. And the second book is explanation of why they can't immediately search for that character. It's not until the third book that they go on said rescue mission. So you have a minor detail which is tangential to the story, and yet there still is this promise of, hey, we'll deal with it when we can. We just can't do it yet. And then that tangential point circles around to become the main plot later on. So that's what I was alluding to earlier. And you see how that's what I was alluding to earlier in this episode, how book 1 leads to book 3, but they can't happen because of book 2. So an important detail gets defined and then paid off later, even in my own episode. Now, in the first 2 books, that missing character affects the other characters' decisions because the missing character isn't forgotten, and it is a driving point of a couple of decisions. But it's just pushed back in priority because, saving somebody is important, but also preventing their hometown from being destroyed is a little bit more important in the moment. So, TLDR, don't create a mystery as the driving plot point only to never explain that mystery. Now, because I was bored with these recent shows, here's a quick bonus number 6. Don't throw out the past while also pulling from it. And before I finish this off, let me see how chat is going. Looking at you, Game of Thrones. Yes. Yeah. The creators of Game of Thrones literally had a grass is greener on the other side type experience. And they just gave up on Game of Thrones and decided to go do Star Wars. But again, they kind of dropped the ball with Star Wars 2. So they gave up on Game of Thrones to kind of ruin 2 different series. Yep. You said it best. Oh, man. What's Bad Batch? Oh, sorry. Bad Batch is Star Wars. It's about the clones of Star Wars. So after they execute Order 66, where the clones kill off the Jedi, there was a group of clones who were kind of the Bad Batch, where they were essentially defective, which means that they were able to break out of their Order 66, which means they didn't actually follow it. So instead of going along with Emperor Palpatine, like the rest of the clones, they instead revolted, and they're trying to sort of lead the new revolution. Okay, so last point. Don't throw away the past while also pulling from it. The characters and settings and motivations are all new in some of these stories, like Ahsoka and Doctor Who and everything. But then a long unused fan favorite enemy or character returns. Yet everything associated with that history is ignored. So I'm specifically talking about Ahsoka and Rebels with Thrawn, or Doctor Who, where they brought back, I don't even remember the name of it. It was a demon dog god who explicitly I think it's basically Osiris, or it was Osiris in the 70s, but because that's kind of cultural appropriation, they explicitly stated in New Doctor Who that Osiris was in fact based on this villain. Anyways, um, in Ahsoka, a sharpshooter pilot is now a Jedi. Okay, that's not the strangest twist, and unfortunately, there is some precedence where in the extended universe, Han was retconned to be force sensitive for a time. That's one of the good things about the EU no longer being canon. But they tried to make Han into a Jedi, and that's how he survived, and that's how he's really lucky, or semi Jedi, because again, force sensitive isn't always a Jedi. But a Jedi who we last saw as a decent Jedi, Ezra Bridger, is now terrible in using the Force. Okay, again, that's happened in the past and might make sense that they weren't using their power within the isolation on the other end of the universe, so they let the powers weaken. That can be done if handled with care. It wasn't done with care in Ahsoka. I already explained where you have a character with no force sensitivity with no real force sensitivity who is explicitly said to not be force sensitive or to have a low, I can't believe I'm saying this, M count, which is metachlorine count, which means that they are weak in the force, and is shown trying to move a coffee cup across the table and failing. Now, if she instead had an extremely high M count and was failing because she doesn't have control of her powers, that's an entirely different conversation. But she's told time again that she doesn't really have the force. She's shown to not be able to use the force. And then by the climax of the series, she is 180 turning on that and is extremely capable with the force, and that she's able to throw her friend 20 extra feet. Now, switching back to Doctor Who, what we got instead was a villain from the 70s, as I mentioned, coming back in an absurd manner, which breaks down the second you think about it. It basically was he was hiding in the TARDIS for a long time, and because of the events of this season, grew in power. It's really convoluted to bring back I don't even know if it's a fan favorite, but a previous villain who was extremely powerful and honestly pretty interesting. Um, I will say that the build up to the villain was pretty interesting. So it is a lost god who is thrown outside of time and is trying to make their way back into the universe. And then throughout the season in Doctor Who, they are making mistakes or making specific decisions that are casting things out into the void, where, when you stare at the void long enough, something looks back at you, or however the phrase goes. But that kind of makes sense, and it built up to this really what could have been a great moment. Now, again, ultimately it was disappointing, but whatever. So we have fan favorite characters who are routinely shown as failures. And like I keep saying, that can be interesting. That would be great to see, Ezra, who was training under a Jedi and became really strong in the Force, only to be thrown across the universe and left to his own devices, wherein his own power starts failing. That could have been an interesting plot point to pull through, but they didn't do that. And so the disillusionment of our heroes is a fantastic story thread to pull, except that's not the path the writers chose. What we're left with is nonsense. And so for now, I've given up on Star Wars and Marvel and Doctor Who. I mean, I'll probably keep watching Doctor Who because there are some interesting points in the back burner that were introduced in the season, some great mysteries that I'd like to see resolved, except we don't actually know if they'll go that way. Now, I've lasted longer than many. Richard has commented multiple times that he didn't even get to the sing-along episode. And yes, I do think that as amazing as the music episode was, to end it in a sing-along was extremely dumb. It's extremely dumb. I was making fun of that the whole way, and yeah. But the rest of the music episode was pretty good. So if you watched up until the end, wait until everything gets resolved, and then just cut out before like the characters look to each other and decide to do a sing-along, because that could have been handled better. Because like I mentioned, with Star Wars and Marvel and Doctor Who, these shows are objectively and measurably getting worse. like I keep saying, in terms of objective for what should be subjective, where you have an entire episode that doesn't matter. The plot progression doesn't matter because the story itself doesn't matter. The events were undone. The characters had no lessons learned. So we just basically spent 40 minutes watching them bounce around and, dance to the strings of the writers for nothing. So it's even the writers themselves were disregarding their own new lore halfway through their seasons with contradictory details. And in trying to see the good in a lot of these episodes, I was drawing a blank. There were some good episodes, there were some interesting ones, but Space Babies was interesting with just a really dumb caveat. The music episode was pretty interesting, minus the ending to it. 73 Yards was trash. The two-part finale, the first part was pretty good. The second part, the resolution was dumb. And there was an entire war episode which was pretty interesting, where it was basically well, I'll go ahead and spoil it. There was a planetary war in which basically capitalism is funding the war, except there's no actual villain. So people are going out trying to fight something they can't see and defend their homes from what they think is a external threat, only to basically be blown up by their own landmines that get moved around beneath the surface for reasons. But the episode itself was actually pretty interesting, and it was heavy-handed, but it was heavy-handed in a good way, where it shows the evils of war, how civilians get caught in the crossfire, how soldiers are created and inspired to fight, even if the fight itself is, well, not necessary. Because again, there was no actual villain to fight. It was just a whole bunch of people going out and dying for no reason. So that is a very heavy-handed episode, but it was done in an interesting way. So, there is some good to be seen. It's just that most of the episodes, most of the reasoning behind it wasn't good. There's actually an entire episode where basically Twitter comes to life and decides to kill off the users, which I fully agree. And the fact that the doctor manages to save some civilians, I was really hoping that they would come back as the ultimate villain for the series, for the season, but was disappointed that they in fact survived. So yeah, I was kind of rooting for the characters in the episode to die because that episode was just abysmal. Yeah, I wish I could leave you with something positive. So I guess I'll go with no one sets out to make a turd of a story. And I hope that eventually these nostalgia-infused stories created by committee and obvious cash grabs go away so we can bring back interesting and intriguing stories rather than a worse version of Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, that was Star Wars Episode 7. Because Episode 7 was just Episode 4 redone, only bigger. And going back to what I said about Episode 9, there was a great video about why Episode 9 failed so badly, and it amounts to insufficient time and money. In order to meet their set theatrical delivery date, the plot shifted. So they said, a year and a half from now, Christmas Day, or, Christmas season, December, this movie's coming out, which means that there were sets that were partially done before the script had been fully written. And so they had these sets that were made. They couldn't redo them. They didn't have the time or money to redo them. So they kind of just adjusted the plot, the story, the scenes to match the sets that they had designed, even though those sets no longer had a purpose for being there. So they shot the scenes and then tried to thread the needle and make everything connect later on. In other words, money drove the quality of Star Wars into the shitter. I don't have anything good to say about that. Episode 9 is just terrible because everyone involved, well, not everyone, but because money was the driving factor, and that significantly degraded the quality. So I'm Ben Pick. Thank you for joining me in Writing to Write. I promise I will be more positive next week. In fact, next week I am talking about the indie books I've read recently, which is overwhelmingly positive. Now, let me know in the comments which of your favorite shows have gotten worse with every season they've remained on Netflix. Yeah. well, I've talked enough. This episode's gone long enough. So I will see you next time. Until then, turn off the TV, read a better story created by an indie author, or go back to the OG Timothy Zahn series and enjoy peak quality Star Wars. Now, next week, I'll be sharing some of the amazing stories I've read by indie authors, as I mentioned, and I would rather see these on the big screen and small screens than any of the shows I've referenced tonight. Also, next week will be on a Tuesday instead of my regular Monday, because guess what happened 2 years ago on August 6th? I published Falling Through, my debut novel, on that day. So see y'all next Tuesday, where I will be celebrating my recent indie book reads. And let me check out the chat to see how things are going over there. Oh, thank you. Yes, read in the void. Yeah. So musical episodes, best way of putting it. Thank you, wifey. Adriana said it best. Musical episodes are often the oh my god, we're out of ideas. Buffy, another way of thinking about it is that is a show flexing and saying, hey, we are good enough that we can get away with a musical episode. And I guess, Scrubs did it. It was pretty fun. Shows can pull off a musical episode. Buffy pulled off one musical episode and then proceeded to, I think, have one every season, or there were definitely like 2 or 3 of them, and it just got bad. But Buffy also suffered from being on much longer than it should have, or actually having good endings and then enough of money. Obviously, the money's the root of all evil. But there was enough of a draw for the not for them, but for the owners of Buffy, the I want to say production company. Yes, for Fox to just keep coming back, keep throwing money enough the problems until they have just beaten a dead horse essentially. And yeah, well, for a series about killing vampires, the series was dead long before it was actually taken off the air. Again, Buffy had some really interesting points. The ending was actually pretty cool for how they brought a whole lot of meaning together, but there were a lot of points where Buffy should have ended at the end of the season, and yet because of money, because of audience, they kept bringing it back. So yeah, we had to suffer through a couple of musical episodes. And yeah, I want to thank all of you. This was an exceptionally long episode. And I know I was very opinionated. And even though I mentioned multiple times that things like storytelling can be objective, that is also subjective in itself. So if I'm wrong, let me know. If I completely misinterpreted Ahsoka or Bad Batch, I've been having these conversations with my friend, and he just keeps calling me a sour sport for wanting to find fault in everything. So there's also a lot more derogatory terms that we've used for each other. But he tends to be overly positive and just watches everything and enjoys it. I tend to I tend to look at things analytically and see the faults in them. So yes, obviously, if I'm looking for faults in Ahsoka, which I wasn't intending to at the beginning, but by the end I was just done with it. The same thing with Doctor Who. I was looking for enjoyable episodes, and we got space babies and 73 yards and an entire episode of real life Twitter, which was just really bad. So, you know, I'm going to keep watching Doctor Who. I'm probably not going to keep watching Star Wars. I've given up on Marvel until otherwise proven otherwise. I know there was a big announcement that RDJ is going to play Doctor Doom, because RDJ is apparently the only thing that can breathe life into the Marvel universe, but I'm just not excited for another Doctor Doom story. So I will see you all next week. Yeah, you have a lifelong fan, Richard. We've talked about this offline. I'm going to say it here. You adore Doctor Who. You know it inside and out so much better than I ever will. And yeah, that is really a shame to hear. I do hope Doctor Who. I'm going to still keep watching Doctor Who. I have high hopes for what it could be, but just like with Star Wars, I keep being disappointed. So, you know, and yes, I understand that in modern Doctor Who, there are so many catch-alls for the season finale where like all hope seems lost at the penultimate episode, and then they come back with some timey-wimey nonsense in the last 5 minutes that undoes everything in the season finale. And sure, that's interesting, but it also, I don't know, with so much else wrong with this season, it just didn't feel earned. And again, it was really dumb that they used the line, the opposite of death is life, or the anti-death is life, or something, where they basically just reversed the polarity of what death had done, even though at that point everyone had already died. So they aren't, I don't know. It's whole complicated and convoluted. I'm going to see y'all later. I'm going to go eat dinner. Have a wonderful week, and I will see you next Tuesday where I will talk positively about indie books. Take care.